Be honest. When you feel lonely, stressed, rejected, or bored, is it easier to open a screen than deal with a real person? Because for a lot of people, the answer is yes. Not because they don't want love, not because they don't want connection, not because something is wrong with them, but because real intimacy has started to feel more stressful than fantasy. And that is the part nobody wants to admit. Porn is not always just about pleasure. Sometimes it becomes the place people go when real people feel too unpredictable. A screen cannot reject you. A screen cannot judge you. A screen cannot ask you to be emotionally honest. And that makes it feel safe. But here is the problem. The same thing that makes fantasy feel safe is also the thing that can slowly make real intimacy feel impossible. Because if your brain gets used to desire without rejection, intimacy without vulnerability, and stimulation without emotional risk, then real people can start to feel too slow, too awkward, and too demanding. And if that has ever happened to you, you need to understand something. This may not be a lack of discipline. It may be a learned escape route. Your brain may have learned that whenever you feel lonely, anxious, ashamed, or emotionally empty, the fastest way out is the screen. And once that loop is built, just use more willpower is not enough. Because you are not just fighting desire, you are fighting comfort. You are fighting habit. You are fighting a digital environment designed to pull you back in. So stay with me, because by the end of this episode, you are going to see why fantasy can become safer than real people, why that safety has a hidden cost, and why the real solution is not just self-control. It is something most people never think about. Changing the environment that keeps making digital escape easier than real connection. This episode is not about shaming sexual desire. Desire is normal. Fantasy is normal. Curiosity is normal. But there is a difference between choosing pleasure and needing escape. And once you understand that difference, the whole pattern starts to look very different. A lot of people think porn is powerful only because it is sexual. But psychologically, part of its power is control. Ever wonder why swiping on a screen or retreating into a digital fantasy feels so much more comforting than actually going out and meeting someone? It turns out your brain may be caught in an evolutionary hack, what some people call the fast food effect of modern intimacy. Our brains evolved in a world of scarcity. They were built to crave high-calorie rewards and mating opportunities because those things were rare, valuable, and required real effort. But modern technology has learned how to package those old biological rewards into something instant, private, and effortless. Just like eating a Twinkie gives you an immediate blast of sugar, digital fantasy can give you a guaranteed friction-free dopamine hit without the emotional heavy lifting required by a real relationship. With real intimacy, there is uncertainty. You might wonder, am I attractive enough? What if I disappoint them? What if I get rejected? That is what makes real intimacy emotionally risky. It puts you in contact with another human being, and another human being is not controllable. The brutal truth is that real people are messy. They have their own moods, boundaries, and fears. They can frustrate you, pull away, or need something from you emotionally. So real intimacy requires emotional courage. But porn removes most of that. There is no negotiation, no rejection, and no need to be known. Fantasy becomes a rejection-proof sandbox where you control the environment and the timeline. You choose the scene, the pace, and when to leave. For a brain that feels anxious around intimacy, that can feel incredibly safe. It is not just stimulation. It is control without vulnerability. And that is the part people do not talk about enough. Sometimes a person is not only chasing arousal, they are chasing relief. Relief from loneliness, relief from stress, relief from the fear of not being enough. And when something gives you relief quickly, your brain remembers. That is how the loop begins. You feel anxious, lonely, or emotionally empty. Then you watch porn. For a short moment, the feeling changes. You get stimulation, distraction, and escape. So your brain learns, when I feel bad, this makes it go away. But the original feeling did not actually get resolved. The loneliness is still there. The fear of intimacy is still there. The insecurity is still there. So when the feeling comes back, the brain reaches for the same escape again. Not because it makes your life better, but because it makes discomfort disappear for a moment. That is called negative reinforcement. It means a behavior becomes stronger because it removes an uncomfortable feeling.
And this is why some habits become hard to stop.
Not because they are always deeply satisfying, but because they are very good at numbing something you do not want to feel. If this is making you see the pattern differently, like this video and subscribe. This channel is about understanding the things people usually suffer through quietly, without language, and without knowing why they keep repeating the same patterns. Now, one of the most important things to understand is that porn does not only stimulate desire, it can also teach a script. There is a theory called sexual script theory. The simple version is this: humans learn what intimacy, desire, and attraction are supposed to look like from culture. That includes movies, social media, and porn. So if someone repeatedly learns intimacy from a screen, especially before they have much real-life emotional experience, their brain may start building expectations around something that is not very realistic. And this is where the hidden cost comes in: the realism gap. When someone spends years consuming hyper-exaggerated, heavily fabricated digital content, the brain can slowly become trained to expect a level of intensity that real, normal human intimacy was never designed to provide. Real intimacy usually does not look like a perfectly edited fantasy. It has pauses, awkward moments, and conversations. It has consent, imperfection, and real emotions that do not always move on command. But if the brain has been conditioned by explosive, multi-angle, friction-free digital benchmarks, then real life can start to feel strangely underwhelming. Not because real life is broken, but because the expectation has been distorted. Some people start feeling desensitized. Some start believing their bodies are broken. Some feel anxious during normal intimacy because real intimacy cannot compete with the intensity they have been trained to expect online. That is the danger of the realism gap. It does not just change what you watch, it can change what you expect from real people. And real people cannot compete with infinite novelty, perfect editing, and a fantasy designed to remove every second of discomfort. Because real intimacy is not just stimulation, it is presence. And presence is harder. Presence means you are actually there with another person, not performing, escaping, or watching from the outside. That can be beautiful, but it can also be terrifying if you are used to protecting yourself through distance. This is why some people can feel stimulated by fantasy, but emotionally avoidant with real people. They may want closeness, but when closeness becomes possible, they get tense, they overthink, they feel exposed. So they return to fantasy, because fantasy gives the feeling of desire without the risk of being truly known. And the newest shift in this digital landscape is not just about physical arousal anymore. It is targeting our core need for emotional connection. Interactive platforms, paid messaging, and parasocial sexual content are not only selling fantasy, they are selling the illusion of mutual vulnerability. You can get the warm feeling of being looked at, chosen, and listened to by an attractive person. But because the interaction is controlled, distant, and often financial, there is much less risk of them breaking your heart. It feels intimate, but it is still protected. It feels personal, but it is still mediated by a screen. This is what we could call cognitive climate change. Technology has engineered a way to extract the psychological rewards of intimacy while deleting the emotional risk that makes intimacy real. Fantasy feels safer because a screen will never reject you, but it might leave your brain starving for a real relationship. And that is the hidden pain. Sometimes the problem is not that a person has too much desire. Sometimes the deeper issue is that they do not know how to feel safe being close to a real person. So porn becomes a substitute. Not because it gives real intimacy, but because it gives a version of intimacy that can never reject you. At first, that can feel like freedom. But over time, it can quietly train you to avoid the very thing you actually want. Because real connection is a skill. Being honest is a skill. Handling awkwardness is a skill. Staying emotionally present is a skill. If you keep choosing the version that requires none of those skills, real intimacy may start to feel more and more intimidating. Not because you are incapable, but because you are out of practice. And this can create a painful split. One part of you wants connection. Another part of you chooses the safer substitute. One part of you wants to be loved, but another part of you is afraid of being seen. That is how fantasy can become a comfortable prison. Not because fantasy itself is evil, but because it can become the only place where you allow yourself to feel desire without fear.
So how do you know when it is becoming unhealthy?
It is not simply about whether you watch porn or not. The better question is, what role is it playing in your life? It may be becoming unhealthy if you only reach for it when you are anxious, lonely, or ashamed. It may be becoming unhealthy if it starts replacing real relationships instead of existing separately from them. It may be becoming unhealthy if, afterwards, instead of feeling relaxed, you feel empty, numb, or more alone than before. That feeling matters, because sometimes the body knows the difference between relief and nourishment. Relief says, the pain stopped for a second. Nourishment says, I feel more connected to myself. And a lot of compulsive habits give relief, but not nourishment. This is where most people get stuck. They finally understand the pattern, but then they still don't know what to do with it. Because knowing why you escape into fantasy does not automatically make the urge disappear. You can understand the loop and still fall back into it the same night. And that is why the next part matters. Because in the next episode, we are not just going to talk about the psychology. We are going to talk about what actually changes the behavior. What makes the urge weaker? What makes real connection easier to choose? And what to do when willpower is not enough. So if this episode made you realize that fantasy has become safer than real people, subscribe. Because the next episode is where we talk about the part most people skip. How to actually break the loop. Not by hating yourself. Not by pretending desire does not exist. Not by relying on motivation that disappears the moment you feel lonely. But by understanding what actually gives you a fighting chance. Because maybe you were never weak. Maybe you were just fighting the wrong battle.